Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for part 2 of the Monday Q&As. So let's knock this out. Hey Jason, sometimes life throws curveballs, and you have to end up leaving the gym midway through your workout. What are your thoughts on finishing the rest of your workout later in the day? Will there be drawbacks in doing so? We could argue this all day long. Now, we could argue that splitting up a relatively long workout, or particularly a short workout, will reduce your total work capacity. There can be an argument made for that. However, the other argument that is made, and this is oftentimes the argument used in top-level sports, strength sport athletes, Olympic-level athletes, is that multiple 2 or 3 shorter but higher intensity sessions per day actually gives you overall better training stimulus because you're able to refresh a bit and work with heavier workloads more frequency. So there may actually be advantages to doing this, but by that same token, from a time economy and a training economy perspective, it is probably better to squeeze everything in because most people don't have time to be going to the gym 2 or 3 times a day, particularly the trips back and forth, the changing clothes. It adds up time versus just getting everything done at once. But technically, from a peak performance perspective, it might be slightly better. We're talking like 1%, trying to chase a 1% edge, and for 99% of you, that 1% edge is irrelevant. It's just not that important. But for someone who's really trying to become a champion, it very well might be, in which case the multiple sessions per day may produce a small edge. It might be worth it for you. The disadvantage is, of course, the training economy aspect. Just something to consider and weigh out. All right, next question. I believe you said you'd like to see the overhead press be a powerlifting movement instead of bench. I wish it'd be brought back to the Olympic comps. How would you train at best assistance for military press? Yes, I have said that. I don't like the bench press. The reason I do the bench press is because I compete in powerlifting. I compete in powerlifting because I love the squat and the deadlift. I'm not a bench press fan. I program the bench press in all of my lifts because 1, it's America's favorite lift. 2, a lot of my subscribers are going to compete in powerlifting. They've got to be proficient in the bench press. 3, 40% of my subscribers are Americans. American football is the #1 sport. A large percentage of my teenage subscribers need to compete in football. You're tested on the bench press in American football. So my programs tend to have it in there for those reasons for my American audience and my powerlifting audience. For everyone else, I mean, I could arguably put something else in for just general strength or hypertrophy. But yeah, I would love to see the strict press returned. And I would say program it just like your bench press. Honestly, you could come in and whatever your program calls for the flat bench, you could just throw in the strict press for it. And as far as accessories for it go, the push press and the behind the neck press, if you're able to do it, but if not, push pressing becomes a great lockout accessory. And you don't need a starting accessory. Just doing pause presses from the bottom gives you your starting strength. And if you need more lockout speed, the push press becomes an awesome accessory. And even failing that, doing some extra tricep work, which you may not necessarily need. It shouldn't be that hard to program the strict press. It's just raw, brutal pressing strength, which you can just use your bench programming for on a strict press. Just swap them around. And if you're worried, if someone doesn't want to bench press and they were to want to do the strict press for whatever reason as their main lift and they need a little more chest development, some weighted dips as an accessory, you could sort that out. All right, next question. Jason, can you please explain whether you need to drop your calories further down as you progress on a cut? If you lost a ton of fat but your lean body mass stayed about the same, wouldn't you still be able to cut at the same amount of calories? To answer the latter part of the question, no, because your body fat, while it is a much, much lower metabolic organ than, say, your muscle tissue is, it still has some metabolism. And carrying around the extra body weight, carrying around an extra 10 or 15 kilos of fat burns more calories just in your day-to-day activities. So losing that will lower your metabolic rate just slightly and your TDEE just slightly. So it is something to consider. It will go down, but the thing is, the question becomes, how much weight do you really need to lose before it starts affecting metabolism itself? And even then, the hormonal impact, we've only seen in the most extreme cases up to 15% change in base metabolic rate based upon starvation type dieting on hormones. So it isn't that severe. So the question really becomes, how much do you need to lower calories again? Well, it depends on how big your deficit was, how much weight you've lost, and if you've got up to that threshold where you're starved to the point to where you've hit 10 or 15% shifts based upon hormones. There's no fixed answer. It depends upon if you've lowered your total energy turnover enough to need to lower calories further. Yes, it is very possible, particularly if you're not on a very large deficit. If you're running a real small deficit and you're losing a lot of weight for a year or two, it is very possible that you could reach a threshold to where you stop losing. But if you've been weight training and gaining muscle and you started as a noob all that time, it's probably pretty unlikely. Someone who hasn't gained much muscle mass, yeah, it's very possible in a small deficit. If you're on a large deficit, though, it's pretty unlikely you're going to experience a true stall. Your stall is probably based upon some psychological factors to where you're overeating and not admitting it to yourself, or you've just hit a temporary situation to where you're holding extra water for a month and eventually you will swoosh. So if you're at a large deficit, it's pretty unlikely. All right, next question. I saw Jeremny Hamilton mention that he uses deficit deadlifts as an accessory to aid lockout speed, not off the floor speed. In your opinion, what is the primary benefit of deficit pulls? I agree with the first part of his statement, but not the second. And the reason for that is, and I didn't hear his statement, I'm going off what you said, is speed off the floor is lockout speed on the deadlift. How often do you see a really good deadlifter hit a true max at competition to where he stalls in the middle? Most of the best pulls, the guy keeps good bar speed from the bottom to the top. If you can improve your bar speed off the bottom, it will make the rest of the pull faster. You've got more inertia. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. When the bar slows down or stops, you've got to generate more force to get it moving again. So the faster you can pull off the floor, the easier the lockout should be on a deadlift. So the deficit deadlift builds more strength off the floor, more speed off the floor. You get it moving faster. That is going to give you a better lockout. He's right. It will give you a better lockout. And there's at least reason to think that deficit deadlifts might produce slightly better hypertrophy, particularly in certain muscle groups. If you can get more hypertrophy in those primary movers on the deadlift, of course the overall deadlift is going to go up. So it's all around a useful tool, and I do agree that it actually does improve the lockout, but it does so in large part by increasing the speed out of the bottom. And remember that when you're talking about raw lifting, starting strength and speed out of the bottom of a lift is lockout work, because it's easier to lock a weight that's moving faster. So always keep that in mind. All right, next question. Could you do full body intermediate program, or go into depth on why you made an upper lower split intermediate program when you always so valiantly recommend full body style of training? Thanks. The reason I did that program that way was to give people more balanced strength and balanced development, because not everyone on a higher volume program like that wants to start with the squat and the deadlift all the time. It isn't an upper lower. The primary exercises are focused upon squat and deadlift, which are upper and lower exercises. In fact, the deadlift will put more meat on your upper body than it will your lower body, in my experience, the conventional deadlift at least. And we could argue that a properly done barbell row does work the posterior chain. So and even the standing press is some lower body potentially involved, not a lot. So it is full body each day with an emphasis on certain exercises. But the fact of the matter is, I left the accessory work open to your specific sport. Tons of people do things like power cleans, Olympic lifts, adding extra squats or front squats every day, extra types of pulls, even extra pressing of some type every single day. So once the accessory work is added in, particularly for a strength athlete, that program very quickly with the accessory work, and a lot of the accessory work that I might write for someone who's on it based upon their specific needs would end up making it a full body anyways. So just because I have an emphasis on certain exercises at the start as the primary exercises each day doesn't mean once the accessory work is thrown in that it's not going to end up full body. And that is my intention, is that a lot of athletes, if not the majority, when they add their accessory work in for their specific sport, that program, the basic template, will end up being full body with the way that they do it. So that is the reason I wrote it that way. And I know that created some confusion as to why I used a standard template like that to start with. And it was because I figured the full body would be addressed by most people's accessory work once they throw in their sport specific needs. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. It was just mainly there to focus on certain exercises as the dominant movement each day rather than to think of it as an upper and lower split. It's just it happened to fall in that pattern. And I could have done it different. If I wanted to remove that stigma, I could have thrown the rows in and the standing press on the squat day and thrown the bench press in on the deadlift day and made that illusion go away, and the program would be just as effective that way. It's just the way I happened to have balanced it. All right, next question. What's the difference between training hard and going to failure? Well, it's possible to train to failure without training that hard, because if you're training to failure and you're using a bunch of really weak exercises and you only do one real set to failure, and you're not doing really either large amounts of volume with it or many high RPE sets, and you're just doing one high rep set to failure and you're using fluff exercises, that's not training hard. And by that same token, when you start looking at RPE scale, if you are going in and hitting true training maxes all the time, you are incorporating a lot of big, heavy, painful compound movements like the deadlift, the squat, the power clean, push presses. All these big, heavy barbell movements that are very taxing on your body, and you're taking those up to true training maxes regularly, or even with your higher rep sets, you're working with heavy loads for high reps, and you are hitting true RPE 9 sets, or you are dragging out a 10 rep or an 11 rep set to failure after your heavy work on these big barbell movements, or stopping one rep short of failure, like you hit one grinder and you stop, but you're doing large amounts of the heavy barbell movements. You are training very, very hard without training to failure. So therein lies your difference. Training hard doesn't have to include failure, but training to failure can definitely be part of training hard, because anyone who's ever taken a barbell squat with 80% or higher of their max, taken it to failure, or doing weighted chin-ups of 5 to 6 reps to actual failure, to where you actually fail mid-rep on one of them, after doing those heavy squats, doing say some Widowmaker squats or something, it is brutally hard. So yeah, training to failure on the right exercises can be training hard, but training to failure on some fluff exercises isn't that big of a deal. It's just not hard to train curls to failure. It's hard to train a Widowmaker barbell squat to failure, or weighted chin-ups to failure from a dead hang. And particularly if you come in and do 4 or 5 sets of them that way. So always keep that in mind. People's ideas of training hard vary. All right, next question. If someone does sumo deadlift, should they do things such as deficit deadlifts and block pulls with a sumo stance also? Okay, tricky question. My observation of some very successful sumo pullers, and I know quite a few, even though I'm not a fan of the sumo deadlift, a lot of them do their deficit pulls conventional. And I know some guys who are like 700-pound sumo deadlifters who regularly do 600-pound deficit deadlifts with a conventional stance. So put that in perspective, and then they feel it does improve their strength out of the bottom, gives them more pop out of the bottom. Whereas, and I would say, if you're going to do block pulls, since the thing is, the reason you're doing the deficit is to make the range of motion longer. Usually one of the big advantages of the sumo deadlift is not only the change in leverages and bar paths, but that it shortens the range of motion. Well, you're just dropping the range of motion back down on an exercise that was invented to shorten the range of motion. It's arguable the benefits. And since we know the deficit has a potential for more hypertrophy, you might as well pull the range of motion out as long as you can by doing it a conventional deficit to get more hypertrophy also. So that's kind of the line of thinking there. And then of course with the block pulls, you really are trying to overload the lockout. And since your lockout is always going to be with the torso position for the sumo, it isn't designed to get you off the floor faster or to really always produce more hypertrophy out of the movers out of the bottom. You could go ahead and do your sumo stance. If you compete sumo with the block pulls, that's probably how I would program it for someone if they felt they needed them. And it's also the situation to where with the sumo deadlift, the lockout can actually be the hardest part. And accordingly, you might want to train your lockout strength then using the sumo stance and bar path. So that's also another reason to do it that way. So your deficit work should probably be conventional and your partial work should probably be sumo. Just my opinion on it. No right or wrong answer there. That's just the logic behind it and the way I would program it for someone personally who was pulling sumo and using those variations as accessories. All right, next question and last question of the week. Hey Jason, what is your stance on pre-workout supplements and should they be a part of a natural athlete stack? I'm not a fan of pre-workouts. I understand some people need them. I don't see the point because people are psyching themselves up, getting their adrenaline going and everything for something that may not be giving them any benefit. Oftentimes they're addictive, they're expensive, and they're still not proven to give you better benefits because the extra fatigue they create might slow down recovery to the point of where it reduces training frequency and it offsets any benefit you got from the extra stimulation in the gym. So we've got different variables to where they may not be helping you at all, or might even be hindering your progress in addition to the fact that they're oftentimes addictive and expensive and you're spending money for them. So I'm not a fan of them. I understand why a lot of people use them, though. I don't really knock people for using them. That's your own business. However, if you are a drug-tested athlete, I wouldn't ever risk it. In fact, if you are a drug-tested athlete, you need to avoid anything but the most basic of supplements, and you need to make sure that you use a whey protein that has been lab tested by someone like Consumer Reports. Like Consumer Reports has done this a few times, and you go back and look at their lab tests and see which brands tested perfect. Don't have any contaminants or things added in that's not on the label, because that is the easiest way to fail a drug test. Whether you are legitimately clean or you are cheating using drugs, the fastest way to fail a drug test is to put a substance into your body that you do not know is there. A lot of the unethical supplement companies have a long history of doing this. I'm not saying they all do it. Some of them are actually a bit more ethical than that. Some of them are a lot more ethical than that. But there is a long track record of the industry doing that, and if you are a drug-tested athlete, it simply is not worth the risk. Supplements do not give you enough extra gains or benefits that they are worth failing a drug test over or risking it. So be very, very selective in your supplements. Make sure the quality of the testing on them and the purity on them, and know what you're putting in your body. So be very careful of that. And even go look at the WADA warnings. WADA puts out a list of high-risk supplements. Just like I've discussed before, things like colostrum products. WADA has said for years now that colostrum products, you should not use them if you're going to be a drug-tested athlete. They recommend that you do not use it. And that's just one example of many. Same with pre-workouts. Pre-workouts are oftentimes recommended that you not use them if you're going to be drug-tested. And it's because you're running the risk of a false positive with some of these things, or a true positive because they put something in there that was banned and you just didn't know it. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it has been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time. But let me give you guys a bicep shot before I go. Oh, Mount Bicepius.